wind in Three Forks, Wyoming, had teeth. It was the end of winter, 1883, a mean season that refused to die. It clawed at the raw lumber of the new storefronts and screamed down the wide, muddy trench that passed for a main street. The air smelled of wet pine, horse manure, and the sharp, metallic tang of melting snow. Along the hitching rails, men in heavy coats, stained with the grime of a long winter spent indoors, gathered in loud groups. They spoke of cattle, of grass, of the spring drives that would soon pull them south toward the railheads. Their talk was rough and restless. The town itself felt like a coiled spring, all hard muscle and pent-up energy, ready to burst loose onto the plains. Through this, Clara Wills walked alone. She was walking to the courthouse to be married. The dress she wore was not hers. It belonged to Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house owner, and it was a decade out of style. The ivory-colored wool was heavy and stiff. The lace at the cuffs a tired, yellowy gray. It was too large in the shoulders and too tight in the waist, and she could feel the hard ridge of the borrowed corset digging into her ribs with every breath. She carried no flowers, only her hands, clenched so tightly her fingernails bit into her palms. Clara was 22, but she felt as old as the mountains that loomed to the west, dark and indifferent. She was a widow, her first husband, a man whose charm had been as thin as ice over a deep, cold river, had left her with nothing but debts and a lingering sense of shame. He had died in a drunken fall from a horse 2 years prior, and the town had watched her slow, steady decline into poverty with a kind of hungry pity. She was marrying Jonas Reed. Her steps were steady as she passed the mercantile, the assayer's office, the gaping dark mouth of the Red Dog Saloon. She did not look at the faces that turned to watch her. She knew what they were thinking. They saw her desperation, a plain widow hitching herself to the only man who would ask. And what a man! Jonas Reed was a ghost who walked in daylight. He was a reclusive, quiet man who worked odd jobs, breaking horses or mending fences, existing at the fringe of the town's notice until he was needed, and forgotten as soon as he was paid. He was known for two things: a scar that sliced from the corner of his left eye down across his jaw, and the rumor that he had killed his former boss up north. The story varied. Some said it was a fair fight. Others said it was murder, cold and simple. No one ever asked him. No one got that close. He had asked her to marry him 3 days ago. He had found her behind the boarding house, hanging laundry in the bitter wind. Her hands raw and red, he had stood there, turning his hat in his hands, and said, "Mrs. Wills, I have a homestead. It is not much, but it is mine. I need a wife to help hold it." He had not spoken of love, or affection, or even companionship. He had offered a trade, her presence for his provision. It was a bleak and brittle proposal, but it was more than anyone else had offered. She saw survival. She had looked at his scarred face, into his quiet, unreadable eyes, and said, yes. Now, she approached the courthouse, a small, square building of gray stone. He was there, waiting on the steps. Jonas Reed was not a handsome man. The scar pulled one side of his face into a permanent, grim set. He was tall, leaner than she remembered, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his one clean, mended shirt. He wore dark trousers and heavy boots. No suit, no tie. He had shaved. The raw skin of his jaw looked scraped. As she approached, he merely watched her, his expression giving nothing away. He took off his hat, revealing dark hair cut short. He nodded once. "Mrs. Wills." "Mr. Reed," she replied, her voice small against the wind. Before she could mount the steps, the doors of the Red Dog Saloon swung open, letting out a blast of warm, sour air and a group of men. It was Silas Croft and his companions, ranchers' sons with too much time and too little sense. They were half drunk, their faces flushed with morning whiskey. Silas spotted them first. He stopped, a wide, cruel grin splitting his face. Well, look here, boys. It's a wedding." His friends gathered around, laughing. "Some wedding." One of them, a lanky man named Abe, snickered. "Looks more like a funeral." Clara felt the heat rise in her face. She tried to step around them, to get to the courthouse door. Jonas stood as still as the stone beside him, his gaze fixed on the distance. "Where'd you get the dress?" "Clara," Silas called out, blocking her path. "Did Mrs. Henderson finally throw it out with the rags?" "Leave her be, Silas," a passing woman said, but she did not stop. "And look at the groom," Abe jeered, turning his attention to Jonas. "Cleaned up real nice. Reed, did you wash the blood off that shirt before you put it on?" Jonas did not move. He did not look at them. He seemed to be listening to something far away. Clara's stomach tightened. She wanted to run. "She's desperate. That one," Silas said, his voice dropping to a conversational, carrying tone. He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the mud, narrowly missing the hem of her borrowed dress. "Heard her first husband drank himself to death just to get away from her. Now she's marrying a killer." He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Guess a desperate woman will take any man, even one who—" The word was never spoken. Jonas Reed moved. It was not fast, but it was final. He took one step down, placing himself between Clara and the men. He was still not looking directly at Silas, but his presence was a sudden, cold weight. The wind whipped his hair across his forehead. The street, which had been noisy with wagons and talk, seemed to fall quiet. The only sound was the howling of the wind in the telegraph wires overhead. Jonas's voice was low. It was not a shout. It was a measured, gravelly thing, barely louder than the wind itself, but it cut through everything. "Say that again." It was not a request. It was not a threat. It was a simple, terrible statement. Silas Croft's smile froze on his face. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving the whiskey flush in patches. He was a bully, but he was not stupid. He had seen bar fights. He had seen men angry. He was seeing something else entirely in the flat. Gray eyes of Jonas Reed. He saw a man who was not angry, but was standing on the very edge of a deep, dark drop, and was perfectly willing to pull Silas in with him. The silence stretched. Silas's tongue darted out to lick his lips. He tried to hold the stare, but his gaze faltered, dropping to the scar on Jonas's jaw, then to the muddy street. I was just funnin'," Silas stammered, taking a clumsy step back. "That's enough," a new voice barked. Sheriff Brody pushed through the small crowd that had gathered. He was a large man with a gray mustache and tired eyes. "Silas, you and your boys get back to the saloon or I'll run you in for the night. Go on, get—" Silas did not need to be told twice. He and his companions melted back toward the saloon, their bravado gone. "Mr. Reed, Mrs. Wills," the sheriff said, nodding to them as he held the courthouse door. "The judge is waiting." Jonas turned, his face as impassive as it had been before. He looked at Clara, then motioned with his head toward the door. She walked past him, her body shaking so hard she feared her legs would collapse. She could feel the stares of the town on her back, hotter and sharper than before. The ceremony was over in less than 5 minutes. The judge's office was small and smelled of stale cigar smoke and old paper. He read the words from a book, his voice a monotone drone. Clara and Jonas stood side by side, but not touching. Their I-do's were quiet, lost in the shuffling of papers. They signed the ledger. Jonas's hand was steady. Clara's signature was a spidery, trembling thing. And then it was done. They were man and wife. The judge grunted, "Congratulations," and turned back to his desk. They stepped back out into the cold, windy street. The crowd was gone. It was just the two of them on the steps. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, the borrowed dress suddenly feeling paper thin. The wind cut through the wool, and a violent shiver ran through her. She felt brittle, as if she might shatter. Jonas stood beside her for a long moment. He looked up at the gray sky, then down the street. He seemed to be weighing something. Then, with a sigh so quiet she almost did not hear it, he began to unbutton his coat. It was a heavy sheepskin coat, worn and stained, the wool lining flattened with use. He shrugged it off. He did not try to put it around her shoulders. He simply held it out. Clara looked at the coat, then at his face. His expression was blank. She took it. "Thank you," she whispered. She slid her arms into the sleeves. The coat was huge, swallowing her. It fell almost to her ankles, but it was warm, incredibly warm. It smelled of him, of pine smoke and leather and clean, cold air. She pulled the collar up, and the scent was overwhelming. It was the first simple, uncomplicated kindness she had known in years. He nodded, put his hat back on, and walked toward the livery. "I'll fetch the horses," he said over his shoulder. The ride out of town was silent. He had purchased a placid brown mare for her and packed 2 saddlebags with supplies, which he'd tied behind his own saddle. He rode a tall, rangy buckskin gelding that moved with a nervous, powerful energy, much like the man on its back. They did not speak. Clara, enveloped in his coat, kept her head down against the wind. They rode past the edge of town, past the last sad wooden shacks, and out onto the plains. The land was vast and terrible. It was an ocean of brown, frozen grass, broken by patches of stubborn, gray snow in the dark, skeletal shapes of sagebrush. The wind was relentless here, a physical force that pushed against them, screaming in their ears. The sky was a low, bruised ceiling of clouds that stretched from one end of the world to the other. There was nothing else. No trees, no rivers, no sign of life. Just the endless empty land and the crushing cold wind. Clara felt a rising tide of panic. This was isolation she had never imagined. It was bigger and emptier than her grief. Emptier even than her loneliness had been in town. She had to break the silence. She urged her mare up beside his horse. "The wind is cold," she shouted over the howl. Jonas kept his eyes on the horizon. "Aye," he replied. She tried again, her voice thin and whipped away by the gale. "Thank you for what you did, back in town." He turned his head for a second. His eyes met hers. They were gray and as flat and cold as the sky. He gave a single, sharp nod, then turned away, facing forward again. Clara fell back, letting her mare trail a few paces behind. She sensed the wall around him, a thing built of more than just quietness. It was a fortress of pain, of distance, and she had no idea how to breach it. She pulled his coat tighter, burying her face in the warm, rough wool, and rode on in his shadow. They rode for hours. The sun was a weak, watery spot in the clouds, beginning its descent. When the foothills finally rose from the plains, they were dark, rocky, and covered in thin, hardy pines. Jonas led her up a narrow, winding trail, and then she saw it. She had known it would be small. He had told her it was not much, but her heart sank. It was barely a cabin. It looked less like a home and more like something the earth had tried to swallow and then spit back out. It was a small, one-room structure, half sod, half timber, pressed up against a low rise in the land as if for protection. The roof on one side had fallen in and been repaired with raw, unplaned logs and packed earth. The chimney was a precarious pile of river stones. A small, broken-backed corral stood nearby, its fences leaning. It was the loneliest place she had ever seen. The wind moaned as it swept around the corner of the small building. There was no other sound. Jonas swung down from his horse. He walked to the mare and stood by her head, but made no move to help Clara dismount. She did so herself, her legs stiff and clumsy from the long ride. She clutched her one small bundle of belongings. "I'll see to the horses," he said. He took the reins of both animals and led them toward the ramshackle barn. Clara stood alone in front of the cabin door. This was her home. This was her new life. She pushed the rough wooden door open. It was dark inside and cold as a tomb. A single dirt-caked window let in a sliver of gray light. It was one room. A stone fireplace, black with soot, dominated one wall. Against the far wall was a crude bed frame, just wood slats with a thin, straw-filled mattress. A single, three-legged chair sat beside a rickety table. The floor was packed earth. Jonas entered, his arms full of firewood. He stomped the snow from his boots and moved to the fireplace. He did not look at her. He knelt, his back to her, and with a frontiersman's quick, efficient motions, he used his flint and steel to strike a spark. In moments, a small, hungry fire was catching on the dry tinder. The silence in the cabin was heavier, more suffocating, than the silence on the plains. It was broken only by the sharp crackle of the new fire and the relentless, mournful cry of the wind outside. Jonas stood and brushed the dirt from his knees. He moved to a small shelf and took down a tin coffee pot and 2 tin cups. He went outside, presumably to a well or stream, and returned with the pot full of water. He hung it over the fire to boil. He sat on the single chair, leaving her to stand. She felt awkward, an intruder. She looked at the bed. Their bed? She looked at him. He was staring into the flames. "Finally," he spoke, his voice rough. "The bed is yours." Clara looked at him, confused. "And you?" He gestured to the saddlebags he had brought in. "I have my role." He would sleep on the floor. Relief warred with a strange, new kind of loneliness. This was not a marriage. It was a shared shelter. The coffee boiled. He poured 2 cups, handing one to her. She took it, the metal already hot. He took his own and sat down again, cradling the cup in his hands. Clara slid down to sit on the floor, leaning her back against the cold wall, keeping her distance. They drank in silence. Night fell outside, pressing against the small window. The fire cast flickering, dancing shadows that made the small room seem larger and more menacing. And then, from the hills, came a new sound. A high, thin, yipping wail that multiplied. A chorus of coyotes. Clara flinched. Jonas did not seem to notice. He just sipped his coffee. She watched him. He had taken his hat off. The firelight played across his face, catching the pale, raised line of the scar. It was an ugly thing, a mark of violence that defined him. He turned his head slightly, as if sensing her stare, and the firelight illuminated the damaged skin. It twisted his mouth, making him look as if he were in constant pain. He was a stranger, a man rumored to be a killer, a man who had faced down bullies with 2 words, a man who had given her his coat but would not share a bed. Clara pulled the heavy coat tighter around her shoulders, her fingers tracing the wool lining. The coyotes cried again, a sound of wild, desperate hunger. She looked at the man she had married and wondered, with a cold, sinking dread, what kind of man he truly was, and what, in God's name, she had done. The first days were a lesson in silence. The cabin was a cold, cramped box of it. They moved around each other with the awkward, careful motions of strangers forced to share a cell. The air was thick with the things they did not say. Clara awoke each morning to the gray, freezing light before dawn. Jonas would already be gone, his bedroll neatly tied and stowed by the door. He left for her a small stack of firewood, precisely cut, and the heavy axe leaned against the wall. The silence he left behind felt as vast and cold as the plains outside. Her life became a small, hard circle of tasks. She fought the grime that was ingrained in the very wood of the cabin. She scrubbed the floors, washed the few tin plates and cups, and tried to patch the chinks in the walls with mud and dried grass to keep the wind at bay. It was a losing battle. The wind always found a way in, whispering its cold breath across her face as she slept. She cooked. The food was simple. Rabbit Jonas caught in his traps, tough and stringy, boiled with a few wild onions she dug from the frozen ground, cornmeal mush for breakfast, black, bitter coffee. She tried to make bread, but the sack of flour was running low, and the yeast she had was old and weak. The loaves came out flat and hard as stone. Jonas would return at dusk, never later. He would enter without a word, stomping the ice and mud from his boots. He would nod to her, his face dark with windburn and exhaustion. He spent his days in the brutal cold, rebuilding the collapsed fences, his hands raw and bleeding from handling the frozen wire and splintered posts. He checked his trap lines, reset them, and sometimes came back with a pair of rabbits, which he would skin and clean at the wood pile, his movements quick and economical. They ate their suppers at the small, three-legged table. Clara sat on the single chair. Jonas sat on a wooden crate. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons on tin, the crackle of the fire, and the endless, howling complaint of the wind. After, he would take his rifle and a cleaning cloth and sit by the fire, meticulously tending to the weapon. Clara would sit on the edge of the bed, mending, her fingers stiff with cold. The land itself was their jailer. It was a world of gray and brown, a high, empty prairie that offered no comfort. The wind never stopped. It did not just blow, it scoured. It flayed the skin from her face and hands, drove ice needles into her eyes, and screamed in her ears until she thought she would go mad. The streams were locked in ice, and Jonas had to take the axe each morning to break a hole for water. Miles of nothingness stretched in every direction, a crushing, empty weight that pressed in on the tiny cabin. Their isolation was complete. They were two people adrift in a frozen, hostile sea. In her third week, while Jonas was out checking a far line of traps, Clara decided to clean the one piece of furniture in the cabin, a small, battered chest with 3 drawers. It was filled with old rags, a few rusty nails, and a broken harness buckle in the back of the bottom drawer. Her fingers brushed against something small and hard. It was a locket. It was made of silver, tarned almost black, with a simple etching of a flower on the front. The catch was stiff. She worked it open with her thumbnail. Inside was a tintype, the small, formal portrait of a woman. She was young, barely 20. She was not beautiful, but she was pretty, with dark hair parted in the middle and a small, hopeful smile. She wore a lace collar. She looked soft and gentle and untouched by the world. Clara stared at the face. This was his ghost. This was the woman who had owned his heart, the one he had lost. She felt a sharp, cold pang. It was not just jealousy. It was a profound, aching sadness. This smiling, hopeful girl was everything Clara was not. Clara was a widow, worn down by grief and poverty, practical and plain. This girl was a memory, perfect and untouchable. She understood, now, the depth of the wall around him. He was not just quiet, he was grieving. He was not just distant, he was haunted. She closed the locket, the click seeming to echo in the small room. She put it back, exactly as she had found it, underneath the rags. She felt ashamed, as if she had spied on his most private sorrow. That night, she began to listen. She had heard him before, small sounds in the dark, but she had always turned over, buried her head, and willed herself back to sleep. Now, she lay still, watching the firelight flicker on the low roof beams. He was in his bedroll, his back to her, a dark shape near the hearth. The fire popped, the wind moaned, and then he made a sound. It was a low, thick murmur. A word caught in his throat. "No, leave her." Clara's breath caught. She lay perfectly still. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he shifted, his whole body tensing. "Pushed! God, I pushed him!" He was dreaming. His breathing grew harsh, a sharp intake of air. followed by a long, ragged sigh that sounded almost like a sob. Clara's blood ran cold. The rumors from town, the whispers she had tried to ignore, came rushing back. A killer, the man who died, the boss's brother. He was not dreaming of the girl in the locket. He was dreaming of a violent quarrel. He was dreaming of guilt. She lay there for an hour, listening to his tormented sleep. The man on the floor was not the quiet, steady man who chopped her wood. He was a man carrying a burden so heavy it broke his rest, a man who believed he had done something unforgivable. She pulled the blankets up to her chin, a new, more complicated fear settling over her. They ran out of coffee, then flour. The salt was a bare pinch at the bottom of the sack. The trip to Three Forks could not be delayed any longer. They rode in together, the silence between them heavier than ever. Clara was no longer just afraid of his past. She was afraid of the guilt that lived inside him. He seemed to feel her new reservation. He kept his horse a few paces ahead, his shoulders set, as if he were pulling a physical load. Three Forks was different. The thaw had come, turning the main street into a river of thick, churning mud that sucked at the horses' hooves. The town was alive with the raw, loud energy of spring. Cowboys, readying for the drives, filled the street. Wagons were being loaded. The air of restless waiting was gone, replaced by a feeling of purpose. But the stares were the same, as they dismounted and tied their horses to the rail in front of the mercantile. Clara felt the eyes on her. The whispers started before they even reached the boardwalk. They stepped inside. The store was warm and smelled of cinnamon, cured tobacco, and new leather. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, was behind the counter. His wife, the woman who had loaned Clara the wedding dress, was there too. She saw Clara and her face tightened. She gave a short, cold nod, and then turned her back, busying herself with a bolt of cloth. Clara felt the heat rise in her face. She turned to the supply list she had memorized, her hands clenched. "Well, look who it is." The voice came from the back of the store, near the pot-bellied stove. Silas Croft was there, his chair tilted back against the wall. Abe, his lanky friend, was beside him. They were not drunk this time. They were just mean. The happy couple. Abe snickered into his hand. Silas watched them. His eyes narrowed, a smirk on his face. "Come for more charity, Clara, or did your man finally get paid for whatever it is he does?" "Hush, Silas." "Mister," Henderson said, but his voice had no authority. Clara kept her back to them. She walked to the counter. "Mr. Henderson, I need 20 pounds of flour, 5 pounds of salt, coffee, and a side of bacon." Jonas had moved to the hardware section, his back to everyone. He was inspecting axe handles, seemingly deaf to the world. "Heard she married him just to eat," Silas said to Abe, his voice loud enough to carry. "Smart, really. A widow's got no options, especially one whose first husband—" "Silas, that is enough." "Mrs.," Henderson snapped, her face red. "And him," Abe whispered, gesturing with his chin toward Jonas's back. "Heard they ran him out of the Bighorn Basin. Heard he killed a man over a card game. Or was it a woman? I hear all sorts of things." "I heard," Silas said, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial, carrying tone, "that he knew she had no dowry, so he killed a freighter for his payroll just so he could look like he had money to marry her." The story was new and ridiculous, but it still struck Clara like a slap. She felt the humiliation as a physical weight, a sickness in her stomach. Her vision swam. She wanted to run, to scream, to disappear, but she did not. She gripped the edge of the counter. She held her head high and stared at a tin of baking powder as if it were the most interesting thing in the world. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. Jonas finished his inspection. He brought 2 new axe handles to the counter, along with a box of cartridges. He laid them down. He still had not looked at the men by the stove. He pulled a small leather pouch from his pocket and emptied a pathetic pile of coins onto the wood. It was barely enough. Mr. Henderson counted the coins slowly. He looked at the bacon, then at the money. With a sigh, he pushed a few coins back toward Jonas. "That'll cover the rest. The bacon's on me, for the winter." It was a gesture of pity, and it was almost worse than the insults. Jonas looked at the coins, then at Henderson. He nodded once, scooped them up, and put them back in his pouch. He gathered their supplies. He hoisted the heavy sack of flour to his shoulder as if it weighed nothing. He took the other parcels. "Ma'am," he said, his voice flat. Clara turned and walked out of the store. She did not run. She walked with her back straight, her chin up, through the silence that had fallen. She could feel Silas's smirk burning into her back like a brand. Jonas followed. He tied the supplies to his saddle and then moved to her mare. He held the bridle, his face a mask of stone. He offered her no help to mount, but he waited. The ride home was a torment. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with shame. The world had proven itself cruel. Just as Jonas had implied, she had married a man the world despised, and now it despised her too. That night, the cabin was suffocating. Clara could not eat. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped in her lap, staring at the floor. Jonas ate his small portion of cornmeal, cleaned his plate, and sat at the table. He was not cleaning his rifle. He was just sitting, his large hands resting on his knees. The fire popped. The wind whistled. "I am sorry." His voice was so low, it startled her. She looked up. He was not looking at her. He was staring at the dark, dirt-caked window. "It is not your fault," she said, her voice wooden. "They are cruel men." "Not for them," he said, his voice rougher now. He turned his head and looked at her. His gray eyes were dark with an emotion she could not name. "For the world, for it being like it is." He looked down at his hands. It's a hard thing to be tied to a man they talk about. He was apologizing for himself, for the rumors, for the mark he carried that now, by marriage, was hers as well. He stood up, unrolled his blankets, and lay down by the fire, his back to her. The words hung in the small, dark room. The first real acknowledgement of the gulf between them, and the first time he had ever tried to cross it. Something changed. It was not a thaw. The air between them was still frigid, but the ice had shifted. Clara woke one morning to a bitter cold. She had dreaded rising, dreaded the shock of the freezing air. She pulled her blanket tighter, then realized something was different. The fire was already built, not lit, but laid in the hearth, with tinder and kindling, ready for a spark, and beside it, the heavy kettle was filled with water. He had risen in the blackness of the night, broken the ice at the stream, and prepared everything for her before heading out to his fences. She stared at the small, thoughtful preparation, and a strange warmth spread through her chest. A few days later, he came in at dusk, a dark line of blood on his cheek. "You are hurt," she said, before she could stop herself. "Wire," he grunted, wiping his face. "Fence snapped." He shrugged out of his coat. The sleeve of his shirt was torn open from the shoulder to the elbow. A long, gaping wound in the fabric. He swore under his breath, a low, frustrated sound, and pulled the shirt off, tossing it onto the table. He was wearing a thin woolen undershirt, and she saw for the first time the muscles in his back and shoulders, hard and defined from endless labor. He turned to the water bucket to wash. Clara looked at the ruined shirt. That night, after he was asleep, she picked it up. She took her small sewing kit from her bundle. The needle was tiny, the thread thin. By the dim, flickering light of the banked fire, she sat on the floor and began to sew. Her stitches were small and tight, a neat, strong line. She did not just close the tear, she reinforced the seam, her fingers aching with the cold and the effort. When she was done, She folded it, as neatly as she could, and left it on the chair. When he rose in the dark, he saw it. She was awake, pretending to be asleep, watching him through her lashes. He stopped. He picked up the shirt. He ran his thumb over the line of her stitches. He stood there for a long time, just holding it. Then, he slowly pulled it on. He looked over at the bed, at her still form, and, for a second, his face softened. He nodded once, to himself, and then slipped out the door into the dark. The true thaw came a week later, not with warmth, but with a storm. It was not snow, it was wind. A ferocious, screaming norther that swept down from the mountains. A solid wall of moving air. It hit the cabin like a freight train. For 2 days, they were prisoners. The world disappeared, replaced by a howling, gray chaos. The wind shrieked, a high, thin sound like a woman screaming. It moaned in the chimney, making the fire gutter and smoke. It slammed against the walls, and the entire cabin shuddered, loose dirt raining from the roof beams. Jonas could not work. He sat by the fire, sharpening his axe, then his knives, then re-oiling his rifle. His large body seemed to fill the tiny room. His energy, usually spent on the land, was now coiled and restless, a dangerous, pent-up thing. Clara tried to sew, but her hands shook. The sound was getting inside her. It was the sound of utter desolation. It was the voice of her loneliness. It sounded like the whispers in the store. It sounded like her first husband, George, coming home drunk, his voice rising in anger. The cabin felt like a tomb, and the wind was the sound of it being sealed. On the second night, the storm reached its peak. A gust hit the cabin so violently that the door was blasted open, slamming against the wall. A vortex of ice and snow exploded into the room, extinguishing the lamp. The fire roared, sending a plume of soot and ash billowing from the hearth. Jonas lunged, fighting the wind to force the door shut, barring it. He turned, his face black with soot, his eyes wide in the firelight. That was when Clara broke. She was on the floor, her sewing scattered. She dropped her face into her hands, and a sound was torn from her, a dry, racking sob that hurt her own ears. It was not a plea for comfort. It was the sound of something inside her finally splintering. Jonas froze. He stood by the door, watching her, his expression lost in the shadows. He looked helpless, like a man seeing a fire he did not know how to put out. "I cannot," she gasped, the words ripped from her. "I cannot do this. I am so tired." The sobs came harder, shaking her whole body. George, he left me. He left me with nothing. Nothing but his debts. The women in town, Mrs. Henderson, they looked at me like I was trash. They stopped speaking. I was so alone. For 2 years. She looked up at him, her face wet, her eyes wild with tears and terror. "I am not strong. I am not anything. I am so afraid of being unwanted." The admission was a raw, bleeding thing in the small, violent room. The wind shrieked as if in mockery. Jonas stood silent for a full minute. He looked from her to the fire, then back to her. He slowly walked to the hearth, picked up the poker, and jabbed at the logs, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. He did not cross the room. He did not offer a hand. He just stood with his back to her. She thought he would say nothing, that he would let her cry, and the night would go on. Her sobs began to quiet, turning to ragged, hitching breaths. He spoke, his voice so quiet it was almost lost in the storm. He was still looking into the fire. "You're not unwanted here." It was not a promise. It was not an endearment. It was not a word of comfort. It was a statement of fact, as simple and solid as the stone of the hearth. He was not offering affection. He was offering a place. Clara stared at his broad, shadowed back. The wind still howled. The cabin was still cold. She was still married to a scarred, haunted stranger. But the icy, crushing weight of her loneliness eased. Just a fraction. She wiped her face on her sleeve. "Jonas," she whispered. He turned. His face was unreadable in the flickering light. The scar, a dark ravine. He looked at her, his gaze steady. He held it for a long, long moment, and in his eyes she saw it. Not pity, but a deep, shared understanding. He knew what it meant to be unwanted by the world. He nodded, a single, brief motion. Then he turned, picked up his bedroll, and laid it out in its usual spot. The storm raged on, but inside the small, broken cabin, the silence between them had finally, truly, broken. The wind that followed the storm was different. It was a chinook, a warm, moist wind from the west that devoured the snow. Spring did not arrive in the Wyoming foothills. It attacked the world, frozen solid for 5 months, shattered and began to bleed. The snow melted in a single, chaotic rush. The high, empty plains became a vast, shallow lake of brown water. The draws and coulees, dry all winter, turned into roaring, muddy torrents. The small stream near the cabin, which Jonas had crossed on a single plank of ice, became a churning, impassable river of sludge and uprooted sagebrush. Travel was impossible. They were marooned. The world beyond their small patch of rising land was a sea of sucking, bottomless mud. This new isolation was different from the cold. The cold had been a sharp, clean enemy that drove them apart. The mud was a thick, clinging, and intimate one. It trapped them together, forcing them to face not just the land, but each other. The cabin, which had felt like a tomb, now felt like a small, damp ship adrift. The roof, patched with sod, began to leak. A steady drip, drip, drip of muddy water fell near the door. The packed earth floor turned soft and yielding. The air was thick with the smell of wet dirt and new, raw growth. "The roof needs mending," Jonas said one morning, staring at the dark, spreading stain above them. "We have no timber," Clara replied, moving the sack of flour to a drier spot. "We have hands," he said. And so they worked. They could not leave the small island of their homestead, so they turned their energy to it. They worked side by side, a new, unspoken partnership forming in the shared labor. They climbed onto the roof, Clara passing him bucketfuls of fresh, clay-like mud while he packed it into the gaps between the logs. Her hands, which had been raw from the cold, were now caked in mud, her nails broken. He taught her. His words were few, but his hands were clear. He showed her how to mix the mud with dried grass for binding, how to test the tension on a wire fence, how to properly swing the axe so the wood split clean. "You are lifting with your back," he said one afternoon, stopping her as she tried to heft a small log. "It will break you." He stood beside her, not touching, but demonstrating. "Use your legs. Let the ground do the work." She tried, and the log came up easier. He nodded. "Aye." His respect was not given in words of praise, but in the tasks he assigned her. He stopped treating her as a liability and started treating her as a partner. She was no longer just the woman who cooked inside. She was the woman who helped him hold the homestead. The horses grew restless, cooped up in the small, muddy corral. "She needs exercise," Jonas said, nodding to Clara's brown mare. "I cannot ride in this," Clara said, looking at the morass. "You can ride on the ridge. The wind scours it dry." He saddled her mare, then his own buckskin. "Come." He led her up the high spine of land behind the cabin. It was rocky and windswept, and the ground was firm. The world was spread out below them, a vast, brown, and watery plain. "You sit too heavy," he called to her. "You are fighting the horse. Let her move under you. Be part of her." He was a different man on horseback. The quiet, earthbound awkwardness fell away. He was fluid, graceful, a part of the animal. He rode his buckskin as if they shared a mind. He showed her how to use her legs, how to shift her weight, how to read the horse's ears. He made her ride faster, to canter along the ridge. At first, she was terrified, clutching the pommel, her body rigid. "Breathe, Clara!" he shouted, his voice whipped by the wind. "You are holding your breath. Let it go." She did. She forced her hands to loosen, her shoulders to drop. She let the air rush into her lungs and felt the powerful, rolling gait of the horse beneath her. The wind tore at her hair, pulling it from its bun. It was cold and clean, and for the first time, it felt like freedom, not a threat. She let out a short, sharp gasp. It was almost a yelp. Jonas, riding beside her, looked over. She was smiling. And then, a sound he had never heard, a sound that seemed as alien in this landscape as a church bell, spilled from her. She laughed. It was not a ladylike titter. It was a real, breathless laugh, born of wind and motion and the sudden, surprising joy of it. Jonas reined his horse in, and his own mouth softened, the scar pulling at his face in a way that was almost a smile. He watched her, and the gray, flat distance in his eyes receded. He was seeing her, not the widow, not the burden, just Clara. The mud receded, the stream slowed, the ground firmed up, and the first pale, tenacious green of new grass appeared on the plains. One evening, Jonas looked at the near-empty coffee tin. "We need supplies," he said. Clara braced herself. "Town," he nodded. "Tomorrow. There is a church gathering, a social," she said, her voice small. He looked at her, his face impassive. "You want to go?" "We are man and wife," she said, her voice gaining strength. "We live here. We are not ghosts. They should see us." He stared into the fire for a long time. "They will look. Let them look," she said. The next day, they rode to Three Forks. Clara wore her one good dress, a dark blue wool she had mended a dozen times. Jonas wore his clean, stitched shirt. They were no longer a desperate woman and a killer. They were a homesteader and his wife. The church was a small, white, clapboard building at the end of the street. It was run by a traveling priest, Father Paul, who came through once a month. The social was held after the short service, a collection of townsfolk sharing coffee and stale biscuits. When they walked in, a hush fell over the room. It was exactly as Jonas had predicted. They looked Mrs. Henderson, holding a tin of cookies, froze, her smile fading. The men, gathered by the door, stopped talking. Silas Croft and Abe were not there, but their companions were, a knot of saloon men nursing tin cups of coffee. One of them, a thick-set man named Eli, watched them, his eyes filled with a lazy malice. Clara kept her head high. She felt Jonas beside her, a solid, silent presence. He did not seem to notice the stares. He just moved through the room toward the coffee pot. Father Paul, a thin, harried-looking man with kind eyes, hurried over. "Mr. and Mrs. Reed, welcome. It is good to see you." "Father," Jonas nodded. "Clara, my dear," the priest said, taking her hand. "You look well. The country air suits you." "Thank you, Father," she said, grateful for the small kindness. The whispers began, a low, insect-like humming behind them. "Look at her, bold as brass, walking in here. With him. Has she no shame?" Clara accepted a cup of coffee, her hand trembling slightly. She and Jonas stood near the wall, apart from the other groups, an island of silence in the buzzing room. Eli, the saloon man, swaggered over, his cup held loosely. He stopped a few feet from them, looking not at Jonas, but at Clara. "Well now, Clara," he said, his voice loud and slurring, though it was barely noon. "Or is it Mrs. Reed now? Hard to keep track." Jonas turned his head, his gaze settling on the man. It was a flat, heavy, neutral look. "You picked a live one this time. Anyway," Eli continued, grinning at his friends, Old George Wills. He was a mistake. We all know that, drank himself into a grave. He took a sip of his coffee. But this one, he laughed, a short, ugly bark. This one's your second mistake, girl. Least George only knew how to kill a bottle. The room went dead silent. The only sound was a biscuit breaking in someone's hand. Clara's face went white. The insult, so public, so cruel, stole her breath. Jonas did not move. He did not tense. He simply set his coffee cup down on a nearby table, his movements slow and deliberate. He turned his body to fully face the man. His voice was not loud. It was the same low, measured, gravelly tone he had used in the street, the voice that cut through wind and whiskey and fear. Say that again. Eli's grin faltered. He was bigger than Jonas, broader in the shoulder, but he was facing the same thing Silas Croft had faced. He was facing a man who was not angry, but was standing on a cliff edge, perfectly balanced. I just said, Eli stammered, trying to hold his ground. I heard you, Jonas said. His voice dropped even lower. I am telling you. Say it. Again. Eli looked at the scar on Jonas's face. He looked at the cold, gray eyes that held no heat, only a terrible, patient emptiness. The bully's courage evaporated. He looked down at his cup, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. It was, just talk, he muttered. He turned and walked quickly back to his friends, who pointedly avoided his gaze. The silence in the room stretched, thick and suffocating. No one looked at them. They looked at the floor, at the ceiling, at their coffee cups. Father Paul cleared his throat, his voice unnaturally loud. Now, Mrs. Henderson, did you say you had a new recipe for... Jonas turned away from the man. He picked up his coffee cup. He looked at Clara. Are you done? She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Father, Jonas said, nodding to the priest. He took Clara's arm, his grip firm on her elbow, and guided her through the silent, parted crowd, and out the door into the clean, cold air. The ride home was long. They did not speak for miles. The silence was different again. It was not empty. It was not angry. It was charged. A heavy, vibrating wire of tension strung between them. Clara kept looking at his profile, the set of his jaw, the hard line of his mouth. He had not defended his own honor. He had defended hers. He had defended her past, her first mistake. He had stood up for the broken, desperate widow she had been. She realized what she was seeing. It was not just anger. It was a fierce, terrible protectiveness. It was a power he held leashed, a violence he kept chained deep inside himself. And she saw, in the rigid set of his shoulders, that this power frightened him. It was the part of himself he hated, the part that had brought him ruin, and he had been forced to use it for her. It moved her so deeply it hurt, but it also scared her. She had seen, twice now, how the world bent and broke around his quiet words. They reached the cabin as the sun was setting, painting the sky in violent shades of red and purple. They did their chores in the fading light, the silence unbroken. He tended the horses. She started the fire. He came inside, the new tension thick as smoke in the small room. He did not go to his bedroll. He did not clean his rifle. He stood by the closed door, watching her as she moved, his eyes dark. She could not bear it. She stopped stirring the pot and turned to face him. "Japnas," she said. He just watched her. She took a step toward him, then another. She stopped, standing just before him. She could feel the heat radiating from his body. She could smell the cold air and leather on him. "Thank you," she whispered. He just looked down at Nair, his face a mask of conflict. She did not know what drove her. It was not gratitude. It was a sudden, overwhelming need to breach the wall, to reach the man inside who was so afraid of his own strength. She raised her hand, her fingers trembling, and laid it on his chest. She could feel his heart, a hard, steady, pumping beat beneath her palm. He flinched, as if she had struck him. His breath hitched. "Clara," he whispered. It was a warning. She did not move her hand. She just looked up at him, her eyes tracing the line of his scar in the firelight. He was the one who moved. He covered her hand with his own. His was calloused, rough as bark, and hot. He did not pull her hand away. He just held it, pressing it against his chest. His other hand came up, slow and hesitant. His fingers, scarred and rough, brushed a stray piece of hair from her cheek. The touch was electric, a shock of warmth. He lowered his head. It was slow, agonizingly slow, as if he were fighting himself every inch of the way. She did not breathe. His lips touched hers. It was not a soft kiss. It was hard and clumsy and desperate. It tasted of coffee and wind and years of loneliness. His mouth was firm, his lips chapped. He did not know how to be gentle. Clara's eyes fluttered closed. She pressed into him, her fear and gratitude and loneliness melting into a single, aching need. This was not a kiss of love. It was a kiss of recognition. Two broken, unwanted people, finding a common shore. His hand left her cheek and tangled in her hair, his grip tightening. His other arm circled her waist, pulling her hard against him. The kiss changed. It deepened, losing its hesitation, becoming a raw, hungry claiming. It was a release of all the pain, all the shame, all the silent nights and cold mornings. It was the breaking of a dam. He lifted her, his arms like steel bands, and carried her the few steps to the bed. He did not lay her down gently. He fell with her, a tangle of limbs and desperate, gasping breaths. Their lovemaking was like the kiss, not tender, but fierce and necessary. It was a collision, a release of all the fear and pain they had held back for a lifetime. In the flickering, dying light of the fire, two people the world had tried to break found a way to be whole, if only for a few desperate, silent hours. Clara woke to the cold gray light of dawn. She was alone in the bed. The blankets were tangled around her. For a moment, she thought she had dreamed it. Her body ached, a dull, pleasant soreness. It had not been a dream. The cabin was empty. The fire was already built, the kettle beside it. But Jonas was gone. His bedroll was gone. She panicked, sitting bolt upright, clutching the blanket to her chest. Had he left? Had he run? Ashamed. She scrambled from the bed, her bare feet hitting the cold earth floor. She pulled on her dress, her hands fumbling with the buttons. She ran to the door and pulled it open. He was there. He was standing 100 yards away, on the edge of the ridge, facing the vast, empty plains to the east. The sun was just a bloody slit on the horizon. His back was to her. His head was bowed, his hat in his hands. He was speaking. She could not hear the words, only the low, tormented murmur of his voice, carried on the wind. He was talking to the open plains, to the rising sun. He was whispering an apology. She watched him, her heart aching. He was not apologizing to her. He was apologizing to the ghost in the locket, to the man he had killed, to a God he probably did not believe in. He was apologizing for this one night of peace, this one moment of connection. He was a man so accustomed to pain that happiness felt like a betrayal. He was afraid to believe in it. He was terrified to have something, finally, that he could lose. She did not go to him. She closed the door, quietly, and leaned against it. Her eyes closed. She would let him have his ghosts. She would wait. He did not come back for an hour. When he did not look at her. He just picked up his axe and began to chop wood. The rhythmic thud, 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 echoing in the cold morning air. 3 days later, a rider approached. It was not a saloon man. It was Father Paul, his black coat flapping. He looked worried, his face grim. Jonas met him at the hitching post. Clara came to the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Father?" she said. "Mrs. Reed, Jonas." He dismounted, his movements stiff. I have come with a warning. I did not want to, but I could not let it go." "What is it?" Jonas asked, his voice flat. "It is Eli, and Silas Croft, and some of the other ranch hands." The priest twisted the reins in his hands. "They are angry. Jonas, what you did in the church, you shamed them. They are talking. They say a man like you, a man with your reputation, does not belong here." "We are on my land," Jonas said. "They do not care," Father Paul said, his voice low and urgent. "They are forming a posse. They call it to drive you off. They say if you will not leave, they will burn you out. They are drunk, and they are angry, and they are afraid of you. It is a bad combination." Clara's stomach went cold. She looked at Jonas. His face had gone utterly still. It was the face she had seen in the mercantile, the face she had seen in the church, empty, cold. But she saw something else, too, a flicker of deep, profound weariness, a hunted look. "I thank you, Father," Jonas said quietly. "You must go." The priest pleaded. "Take your wife. Go north or west. Go where they do not know you. There is no shame in it." Jonas looked at the ground. She saw his shoulders slump. He was going to run. His past, the violence he feared, had returned, and it would destroy them. "No," Clara said. Both men turned to look at her. She stepped out of the cabin, onto the packed earth. She looked at the priest. "Thank you for the warning. Father, we are grateful, but we are not leaving." "Clara," Jonas said, his voice a low warning. She turned to him. "No, Jonas, I will not be run off. Not from here." She looked at the small, patched cabin, at the rebuilt fences. "This is our home. We built it. If they burn it, we will rebuild. That is what people do." "You do not understand," Jonas said, his voice ragged. "This is what I do. I bring this violence. It follows me. Then it will have to face me, too," she said, her voice shaking but unbroken. "I am not that widow anymore. I am not unwanted, and I will not run." He stared at her, his gray eyes wide. Seeing a strength he had never known, he saw her fear, and he saw her standing against it. Father Paul looked between them, at the man haunted by his past and the woman determined to build a future. He sighed, a deep, sad sound. "God be with you then," he said. He mounted his horse and rode away, a lone black figure against the vast, greening plains. Jagas and Clara stood alone, the priest's warning hanging in the air. Jonas looked at the horizon, then at his wife. He was afraid, not of the men, but of himself. But Clara did not move. She stood her ground, waiting, and for the first time, he was not facing the darkness alone. The days that followed Father Paul's warning were heavy with a new kind of silence. It was not the silence of awkwardness or of grief. It was the silence of a held breath. Every shadow on the plains, every gust of wind, every distant cry of a hawk was a potential threat. They worked, but their eyes were always on the horizon. The fragile peace of their shared intimacy had retreated. Jonas was taut as a wire, his old distance returning. But this time, it was a shield. He spent the nights in his bedroll by the door, his rifle beside him. He was a guardian, not a husband. Clara understood. The man who was afraid of peace had been proven right. The world would not let him have it. She did not push. She simply matched his vigilance, his quiet, constant readiness. The warning came on the fourth morning. Jonas rose before the light. As always, Clara heard him go to the barn, heard the familiar sounds of him pitching hay for the horses. Then the sound stopped. There was only a heavy, absolute stillness. Clara sat up in the bed, her heart a cold knot. The silence from the barn was more frightening than any noise. She pulled on her boots and his heavy coat and went outside. The air was damp and cold, the sky a bruised gray-purple. She saw him. He was standing in front of the barn, his back to her. He was not moving. "Jonas?" she called. He turned, his body rigid. "Go inside. Clara." His voice was flat, dead. It was the voice from the church. She walked toward him, her dread growing with every step. "What is it?" He tried to stand in her way, to block her view of the barn door. "I will handle it. Go back to the cabin." "Handle what?" She pushed past his arm, and she saw it. They had been there in the night. Nailed to the center of the door was a raw, new pine board. On it, they had used a hot iron, a branding iron, to burn letters into the wood. The smell of scorched pine and lye hung in the air. The message was black and stark. "Murderers don't belong here." Clara stared at it. The ugly, seared letters seemed to writhe in the dim light. This was not a drunken shout in a saloon. This was a cold, sober threat, delivered in the dark, at their home. They were here," she whispered. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the edge of the board. It was still warm. Jonas watched her, his face a mask of stone. All the weariness she had seen in him before had hardened into a cold, bleak certainty. "It is what I told you," he said, his voice rough. "It follows me. Pack your things. Clara, I will take you back to town. You can tell them I forced you. They will not blame you." She turned to look at him. He meant it. He was prepared to send her away, to be hunted alone, just to keep her safe from the name they had given him. "Take me back," she said, her voice quiet. She looked at the sign, then back at him. "Take me back to what? To Mrs. Henderson's pity? To Silas's insults? To being a ghost in a town that despises me for being poor and alone?" "It is better than this," he said, gesturing to the sign. "No," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the cold air. "It is not." She looked around. They had not just left the sign. They had pulled down a 20-foot section of the corral fence. The posts scattered. The wire cut. It was an act of violation, meant to cripple and to terrorize. Clara walked past him, her head high. She went to the woodpile and picked up the heavy sledgehammer. She walked to the broken fence and handed the hammer to him. "They tore it down," she said. Jonas looked at the hammer, then at her face. He was confused. "If they burn it again, we rebuild," Clara said, her voice shaking with a cold, hard anger she had never known she possessed. "That is what I told you, and that is what we will do. Now, are you going to fix the fence, or am I?" He stared at her, at this woman, covered in his coat, her face pale with fear, but her eyes blazing with a strength that matched his own. He saw she was not going to run. She was not going to break. He took the sledgehammer from her. He turned, walked to the barn, and with the claw of a nearby hammer, he ripped the burned sign from the door. The wood splintered with a sharp crack. He threw the board to the ground and smashed it with his heel. "I will fix the fence," he said. He did not ask for her help, but she gave it. She gathered the cut wire. She braced the posts while he drove them back into the muddy earth. They worked for 2 hours, the silence punctuated only by the ring of the sledgehammer and their own harsh breathing. They were rebuilding their wall. It was a quiet, shared vow. When they were done, he looked at the mended fence, his hands on his hips. "They will come back," he said. "I know," she replied. "It will be worse." "I know." He turned to her, the anguish plain on his face. "Clara, you do not know. You do not know what you are standing beside." "Then tell me," she said, her gaze unwavering. "Do not let me stand blind. I am not afraid of the truth. Jonas, I am only afraid of the whispers." He looked at her for a long, hard minute. He saw the woman who had laughed on the ridge, the woman who had stitched his shirt, the woman who had met his desperation with her own. He nodded once, a sharp, pained motion. "Inside." In the cold, dim light of the cabin, he finally broke his silence. He did not sit. He stood by the cold hearth, as if needing the stone to keep him upright. He stared at his hands. turning them over, as if seeing them for the first time. "I did kill him," he said. The words fell into the room like stones. Clara sat on the edge of the bed. She did not flinch. "Tell me." "It was up in the Bighorn Basin. 5 years ago. I worked for a man named Elias Thorne. A big ranch. Thorne was a hard man, but fair. His brother was named Arthur." He paused, his breathing tightening. Arthur was not a good man. He was weak and cruel because of it. Like Silas, but with real power. He drank, and he had a mean eye for the women who worked there. Clara watched his face, saw the scar pull tight. "There was a girl," Jonas continued, his voice so low she had to strain to hear. "Maggie, she worked in the kitchen. She was just a girl, maybe 16, from back east. Had no one." He closed his eyes, as if seeing it. "I was in the barn, mending tack. I heard a sound, a scream. Cut off. I went to the loft. Arthur had her cornered. He had torn her dress. She was fighting, but he was a big man, and drunk. I told him to leave her be." Clara's breath caught. It was the same words. "He laughed at me," Jonas said, his voice hollow. He said she was his, like a horse, to do with as he pleased. He told me to get out. I did not move, so he came at me. He pulled a knife. Jonas whispered. He was drunk, clumsy, but he meant to use it. I did not have my gun. I grabbed, it was a pitchfork, standing by the stall. He stopped. He would not say the next part. He just looked at his hands. He ran onto it. "Jonas?" Clara asked gently. He shook his head, a single, violent motion. "No, I pushed him. He came at me with a knife, and I pushed. It was fast. He just fell." "His brother, Elias. He found us. Maggie was screaming. Arthur was on the floor. The knife was still in his hand." "What? What happened to Maggie?" "Elias sent her away. Put her on a stage east before the sheriff even came. He told her if she ever spoke of it, he would ruin her. She was terrified. She left. And you?" "He had to choose," Jonas said, his voice bitter. His brother's good name, or his hired hand, it was not a choice. He told the sheriff I had murdered his brother in a drunken fight over cards. He said I was a killer. The town, they believed him. They always believed the man with the big ranch. I left. I have been leaving ever since. Silence filled the cabin. Clara finally understood. The guilt he carried, the thing that haunted his sleep, was not the killing. It was the defense. He was not a murderer. He was a protector. He had saved a girl, and the world had branded him a killer for it. The violence he feared in himself was not a sickness. It was a shield, and it had cost him everything. She rose from the bed and went to him. He was trembling, the confession having taken all his strength. She did not embrace him. She just stood in front of him and took both of his hands in hers. They were cold as ice. "Jonas Reed," she said, her voice shaking with a sudden, fierce emotion. "You are not a murderer. You are the best man I have ever known." He looked at her, his gray eyes shattered, a terrible, lost hope dawning in them. He tried to speak, but no words came. "It does not matter what they write on the barn," she said, her grip tightening. "It does not matter what they call you. I know who you are." He pulled his hands from hers, not in rejection, but to cover his face, his shoulders shaking in a single, silent sob that tore at her heart. He had carried the burden, the name, alone for 5 years. That day, their work was a prayer. They reinforced the barn door. They stacked wood by the cabin. They brought the horses into the small, sturdy barn, not letting them roam. Every action was a preparation, a quiet promise to each other. They would not run. That night, the rain came. It was not a storm, just a steady, relentless drumming on the roof, a sound that shut out the world. It was a cold, weeping rain, washing the soot from the barn, turning the new-cut tracks from the posse into mud. They sat by the fire, the tension of the day draining away, replaced by a deep, aching weariness. He had shared his worst secret, and she had not left. He was on his bedroll, his back against the wall, his eyes on the fire. Clara was on the bed. The small room felt like the only dry, safe place in the world. "Jonas," she said softly. He looked at her. "You do not have to sleep on the floor," she said. "Not tonight." He watched her, his gaze heavy. He was afraid to move, afraid to break the fragile peace. "I am afraid," she whispered, her voice honest. "I do not want to be alone." He rose, his movements slow. He did not go to his side of the bed. He came to hers. He sat on the edge, his back to her. She moved and laid her hand on his shoulder. He was rigid. "It is all right," she said. He turned, and the look on his face was one of profound, aching need. This was not the desperate, crashing passion of their first night. This was something deeper, something born of truth and shared fear. He lay down beside her, on top of the covers, and pulled her to him. He held her as if she were the only thing keeping him from drifting away. The rain drummed on the roof, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat. They shared a moment of fierce, desperate love, a release of all the fear they had held back. It was not a frenzy, but a deep, knowing, silent vow. It was a claiming of life, a defiant, "We are here" against the men who wanted them gone. Afterward, he did not turn away. He held her, his arm heavy across her waist, his breathing finally deep and even. He slept without dreams. The respite lasted 3 days. The rain stopped, and the plains began to dry. Jonas grew more and more restless. "We are low on cartridges," he said one morning. "And salt. I cannot put it off." "You are going to town?" she asked, her heart sinking. "No, to Silas's place, Eli's. They will be in town, drinking. Their ranches are unguarded." "Jonas, no, that is—" "I am not stealing," he said, his voice flat. "I am going to the far side of my own property. I set traps there last fall. I need to check them, but I will be gone most of the day." She knew he was lying, or half lying. He was going to scout, to see what they were planning. "Be careful," she whispered. He touched her cheek, his rough thumb brushing her skin. "Bar the door behind me. Do not open it. For anyone, I will be back by dark." He rode out, his rifle in its scabbard, his back straight. Clara watched him until he was a small dot, then went inside. She barred the door. The day was agonizingly long. The silence of the cabin was a living thing, amplifying every sound. She cleaned, she mended, she baked bread, needing the physical work of kneading the dough. Around noon, she heard it. Horses, more than one. Her heart stopped. She ran to the window, peering out a small, clean patch. It was them. Silas Croft, Eli, and Abe. They were not a posse, just the 3 of them. And they were drunk. They rode sloppily, laughing, a whiskey bottle passing between them. They rode right up to the cabin. "Ho, Clara!" Silas yelled, swinging down from his horse. "Your man's not home. We saw him ride out." Clara's blood ran cold. They had been watching. "Come on out. Murder's woman," Eli shouted, hammering on the barred door. "We just want to be neighborly." Clara backed away from the door, her heart hammering. She looked for a weapon. The fireplace poker. She grabbed it, her hands slick with sweat. "She ain't coming out," Abe snickered. "Maybe she's lonely," Eli said. He went to the window, his face pressing against the glass. He saw her. "There she is. Open the door. Clara, we ain't gonna hurt you. We just want to talk." "Go away," Clara shouted, her voice high and thin. "Get off our land." "Her land," Silas laughed. He unbuttoned his trousers and relieved himself against the cabin wall, right by the door. "This ain't your land. This is decent folks' land. Leave me alone." "Maybe she needs convincing," Eli said. He saw the new baked bread, cooling on the table near the window. With a grin, he punched his fist through the glass. Clara screamed as the glass shattered inward. Eli reached through, unlatched the window, and began to climb inside. That was when Clara's fear turned to rage. This was her home. He was coming into her home. As he swung his leg over the sill, she ran at him, not with the poker, but with her bare hands. She slapped him across the face, a sound like a pistol shot. "Get out!" she screamed, all her terror forgotten. "Get out of my house!" Eli, stunned, his cheek blazing red, fell back out of the window, landing in a heap in the mud. She hit me!" he sputtered, scrambling to his feet, his rage absolute. You! He roared, his face purple. He lunged for the window again. "Eli, no!" Silas grabbed his arm. "Not like this. There'll be a hanging for it. She hit me. Leave it," Silas said, suddenly sobered. He had seen the look in Clara's eyes. This was not the woman they knew. He scrambled for his horse. "Let's go. We'll come back tonight, with the others. We'll do it right." Eli hesitated, glaring at her, his hand on his knife. "Get off my land!" Clara shouted again, standing in the broken window, the poker now in her hand. "Or I will kill you myself!" Eli looked at her, then at Silas, who was already mounted, with a final, venomous curse. He turned and climbed onto his horse. "You will pay for that. You hear me? Tonight!" They rode off, galloping away, leaving a cloud of dust and the reek of whiskey. Clara stood there, shaking. For a long time, the wind blew cold through the shattered window. She did not cry. She just trembled, a deep, bone-rattling shake. She went to the door, unbarred it, and looked at the stain Silas had left. She felt a wave of such profound violation and fury that she almost choked on it. She went back inside and began to clean up the glass. Jonas returned an hour later. He rode in fast, his horse lathered. He had seen them. He swung down before the horse even stopped. Running to the cabin, he saw the broken window, the stain on the wall. He burst through the door, his gun in his hand. "Clara!" She was on her knees, sweeping the last of the glass. She looked up, her face pale, her eyes huge and dark, but she was not crying. She was unbroken. He stopped, the gun lowering. He took in the scene, the broken window, the defiant, terrified woman. They came," she whispered. He did not ask what happened. He holstered his gun, walked to her, and pulled her to her feet. He wrapped his arms around her and just held her, his entire body rigid. He held her, his face buried in her hair, breathing in her scent, his heart pounding against her. He was shaking, not with fear, but with a rage so cold and deep it terrified him. He finally pulled back. He looked at her face, then his eyes drifted to her hand. Her knuckles were red. You hit him," he whispered. She nodded, a small, jerky motion. He tried to climb in. Jonas's face went completely blank. It was the deadliest look she had ever seen. He touched her red knuckles with his thumb, his touch surprisingly gentle. "They touched you," he said. "It was not a question. They came into my home, and they put their hands on you." "Jonas, I'm all right," she said, her voice small. He looked past her, through the broken window, at the hills where they had fled. "I will make sure," he whispered, his voice a low, terrible promise, "that no one ever touches you again." He released her. He went to the door and barred it. He picked up his rifle and began to clean it, his motions quick and economical. "They said they would be back," Clara said, her voice finding its strength. "Tonight, with the others." Jonas nodded. "I know." He did not look like a man who was afraid. He did not look like a man haunted by guilt. He looked like a man who had finally, after 5 long years, accepted who he was. Clara went to the crate where they kept the ammunition. She took the box of cartridges and sat at the table, across from him. She began to load his spare rifle. He looked up, and their eyes met. The town's hatred was coming, but for the first time in their lives, neither of them was alone. They were ready. They did not light the lamp. The fire was banked low. a bed of red coals that pulsed in the darkness, casting just enough light to turn them into shadows. Outside, the night was cold and absolutely still. The wind had died, and the silence that remained was heavy, a suffocating blanket. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, the loaded spare rifle resting across her knees. Jonas stood by the doorway, his body a dark, motionless silhouette. He had nailed a thick plank over the broken window, sealing them in. The cabin was a fortress. It was a tomb. Every sound was magnified, the soft shift of the logs in the fire, the stamp of a horse in the barn. Clara's own breathing, which she held, then let out in a ragged, quiet sigh. Jonas heard them first. He did not move, but his head tilted, his entire body going utterly rigid. "What?" Clara whispered. "Horses," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of all emotion. A dozen, maybe more, moving slow. Clara's heart, which had been a cold, heavy stone, seemed to stop, then burst into a frantic, hammering rhythm. She gripped the rifle, her knuckles white. The sounds grew. The soft thud of hooves on the damp earth, the jingle of a bridle, a low, drunken voice, quickly shushed. "They're here," she breathed. Jonas moved, swift and silent. He took the rifle from her hands. She did not resist. "Jonas, I can—" "No," he said, his voice a low, hard command. "You will not be part of this. Not this way." He pushed the rifle into the corner. By his bedroll, he picked up his own, the one he had been cleaning all evening. "They are coming for me, for the man they think I am. I will not have you in the line of fire." "I will not hide," she said, her voice trembling. "I will stand with you." "You will," he said, and his hands, rough and calloused, gripped her shoulders. He looked down at her in the dim, red light, his face a mask of desperate, cold resolve. "You will stand with me by staying alive. I cannot fight them. Clara, if I am afraid for you, I cannot think. I need to know you are safe. Do you understand?" The first shout came from outside, a torch flaring to life, casting a flickering orange light through the cracks in the wall. "Reed, you in there? Killer? Come on out." "Jonas," she pleaded. He ignored her. He was all cold purpose. "The barn. I showed you the root cellar. Under the hay in the back stall. They will not look for it. They will be focused on the cabin. No, I will not leave you in here alone. Go," he hissed. He shoved her toward the back wall, where a small, rough-hewn door, barely more than a shutter, led out toward the barn. It was a coward's door, built for escape. "Go now. Keep low. Do not look back. And, Clara." He grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him. His gray eyes were on fire. "No matter what you hear, no matter what, you do not come out. You wait until morning. You promise me." Promise me." "I promise." More torches, more shouts. "He's in there. Burn him out. Burn the murderer's nest." "Now," Jonas said. He unbarred the small door, pushed her through, and closed it behind her. Clara stumbled into the cold. Black night. The air was thick with the smell of pine pitch from the torches and the raw, sour smell of whiskey. The shouting seemed to come from everywhere, a confusing, terrifying circle of hatred. She kept her head down, clutching the heavy coat he had given her, and ran, bent low, for the dark shadow of the barn. She slipped inside. The horses were terrified, their eyes white in the dark, snorting and kicking at the stalls. "Shh," she whispered, her voice shaking. She ran to the back stall, her hands frantic, pulling at the loose hay. She found the heavy wooden ring of the trapdoor. She pulled. It was heavy, but her terror gave her strength. It opened onto a black, square hole that smelled of damp earth and potatoes. She scrambled down the short ladder, into the cold, absolute darkness. She pulled the trapdoor closed over her head, leaving it open just a crack. She huddled on the packed earth floor, her knees drawn to her chest, and listened. The first shot was a deafening explosion. It was not Jonas's rifle. It was a pistol, fired close. It was followed by the sound of splintering wood. They had fired at the cabin door. "Come out, Reed, or we'll fire the roof." It was Silas Croft's voice, high and full of drunken power. Clara pressed her hands over her mouth, her teeth biting into her own knuckles to keep from screaming. Then came the answer, the heavy, deafening boom of Jonas's rifle. It was a sound that seemed to shake the earth. It was followed by a sharp, high scream of pain. "He got me! The bastard shot my arm! He shot me!" It was Eli's voice. "He's armed! Get back! Get back!" Silas shouted. "Light the roof! I said light the roof! I can't get close! He's at the window!" Clara pictured him, alone, reloading, his face calm and cold. A target in the dark. Another pistol shot. Crack! The sound of glass shattering. They had shot out the one good window. Then silence. A long, tense moment. "He stopped?" "Maybe you hit him. Silas." "Go see. You go see." A new sound. The heavy thud of something hitting the side of the cabin. Then another. They were throwing their torches, trying to catch the wood. But the wood was damp from the rain. It smoked and sizzled. But it did not catch. "It ain't lightin'. Get more hay. From the barn." Clara's blood ran cold. The barn. They were coming to the barn. She heard the barn door creak open. A man stumbled in, a torch in his hand. She could see the flickering light through the crack in the cellar door. "Get the... Whoa!" It was Abe. He was clumsy. Drunk. He raised his torch. Looking for the hayloft. The horses went mad, kicking and screaming in their stalls. "Easy, you stupid beasts!" He never finished. The back door of the barn, the one leading to the open fields, burst open. It was Jonas. He was not in the cabin. He had used the same escape route as Clara. He was a shadow, a hunter. Abe spun around, his eyes wide. He dropped the torch and fumbled for his pistol. Jonas did not have his rifle. He had his axe. Clara saw him move, a blur of motion. It was not a swing. It was a low, hard strike with the flat of the axe, like splitting a log. The sound was a dull, sickening thud. Abe crumpled to the ground without a sound, his pistol unfired. Jonas did not pause. He grabbed the sputtering torch from the floor, threw it into an empty, stone-floored stall, and ran back out into the night. Clara was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. The fight had moved. She heard shouts from the corral. "There he is! He's by the fence!" A pistol shot. Crack, crack, crack. Then the boom of the rifle. Farther away. Jonas must have stashed it. A man screamed, a short, cut-off sound. He's in the rocks! He's killing us!" Silas shrieked. His voice was no longer brave. It was terrified. "It's a trap! Run! Get the sheriff!" The sound of a horse galloping, whipped into a frenzy, fading into the night. Then silence. A silence more complete and terrifying than the noise. Clara strained her ears. She heard the crackle of the one torch, still burning in the stall. She heard the wind, picking up, whistling around the corner of the barn. And she heard a groan. It was low and close, just outside the barn. The silence returned. It stretched. 1 minute, 5. It was an eternity. She remembered her promise. Wait until morning. But the groan. Had it been Jonas? She could not wait. She pushed the trapdoor open, her movements stiff. She climbed out into the smoky air. Abe lay on the floor, unmoving. She did not look at him. She crept to the main barn door. The yard was a mess. 3 torches lay guttering in the mud. The cabin door was a splintered ruin. Near the corral, a man was on his knees, holding his leg. It was Eli. He was rocking, weeping, his rifle on the ground beside him. Silas was gone. "Jonas?" she whispered into the darkness. No answer. "Jonas!" she called, her voice breaking. She ran from the barn, her eyes scanning the shadows. She checked the cabin. Empty. She ran toward the corral, and then she found him. He was slumped against the far side of the barn wall, hidden in the deep shadow, as if he had been trying to make it back to her and failed. His rifle was on the ground beside him. He was holding his side, his hand covered in something dark. Jonas, she breathed. His head came up. His face was a pale, sweaty mask in the gloom. Clara, his voice was a thin, ragged whisper. I told you to stay. You are hurt. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering over his. Just a scrape. He lied, his teeth gritted. Pistol, got me in the side. We have to get you inside. She tried to put her arm under his, to lift him. He was a dead weight. He cried out, a sharp, pained sound. I cannot walk, he gasped. You must, she said, her voice a low, fierce command. I cannot carry you. You must help me. Jonas, help me. She got him to his feet. It was a terrible, agonizing struggle. He leaned on her, his arm draped over her shoulder, his entire weight threatening to pull them both down. He was gasping, his feet dragging in the mud. Eli, still on the ground, watched them, his face a mask of pain and fear. Help me, Eli moaned. Clara did not even look at him. She dragged Jonas step by painful step across the yard. His blood was on her, hot and sticky, soaking through her dress, through his coat. She got him to the cabin, through the broken doorway, and onto the bed. He collapsed, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She barred the door, not the splintered part, but the heavy bar that was still intact. She lit the lamp. Her hands were shaking violently, but her mind was cold, clear. She had to see the wound. Jonas, I have to. He nodded, his eyes closed. She took his knife and cut his shirt, pulling the wet, bloody fabric away. She stifled a scream. It was not a scrape. It was a hole, low on his left side, in his ribs. It was dark, ugly, and it was bleeding steadily. A slow, dark pulse. Oh, God, she whispered. The whiskey, he gasped, his eyes fluttering open. On the shelf. She ran, her movements jerky. She grabbed the bottle of whiskey he kept for medicine. She grabbed the pail of clean water. She ripped her own petticoat into long, clean strips. She came back to him. Jonas, this will hurt. I know, he whispered. He fumbled for a piece of leather, a strap from his saddlebags, and bit down on it. She took a breath. She poured the raw whiskey directly into the wound. Jonas did not scream. He roared, a muffled, guttural sound, his whole body arching off the bed. Clara cried out, her tears falling as she worked. I am sorry. She cleaned it as best she could. She had to pack it. She took a strip of the cloth, soaked it in whiskey, and pushed it into the hole. He convulsed, then went limp, his head falling to the side. He had fainted. Thank God, she wept. It was easier. She worked quickly, her hands covered in his blood. She packed the wound, made a thick bandage, and wrapped it around his chest, pulling it as tight as she could bear. As she worked, the gray, sick light of dawn began to creep into the cabin. It came through the broken window, through the splintered door, through the new bullet holes in the walls. The night was over. She was sitting beside him, wiping his pale, sweaty face with a damp cloth, when she heard them. Hoofbeats, many, her fear, which had been replaced by the frantic energy of tending to him, returned with a cold rush. Silas. He had come back, with the whole town. She grabbed Jonas's rifle. She went to the door, standing beside the ruined opening. The rifle aimed at the space. Who is there? She shouted, her voice a raw, broken cry. Mrs. Reed, it is Sheriff Brody. Open up, we saw. My God. His voice trailed off as he took in the scene. The body in the yard, Eli, pale and barely conscious. The splintered, bullet-ridden cabin. It is Father Paul. Clara, another voice called. We heard shots. Silas Croft woke the town. He said you were being attacked. Clara's heart seized. He said we were being attacked. Let us in, child, please. We have come to help. She peered through a crack. It was them, Brody, the priest, and behind them, a dozen townsfolk, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson. Other ranchers, their faces were pale, shocked, and horrified in the thin morning light, and Silas Croft was with them. his hands unbound, his face a mask of false, righteous anger. "Sheriff," Silas said, "I told you. He's a killer. He shot Abe. He shot Eli. We came to talk, and he just started firing." Clara felt a rage so cold and pure, it burned away her fear. She unbarred the door, but she stood in the doorway, her small body blocking the entrance, the heavy rifle held across her chest. "Mrs. Reed," the sheriff said, his hand on his gun. "Put the rifle down. Step aside." "No," Clara said. Her voice was not a whisper. It was hard as iron. "You will not come in. You will not touch him." "Clara." "Mrs." Henderson said, stepping forward, her hands out. "Child, you are covered in... We just want to help." "Help?" Clara's voice broke, a high, hysterical laugh. "You want to help now. You stood by, all of you. You whispered. You called him a murderer. You let those men... that man..." She pointed a shaking finger at Silas. "You let him come here. You let him try to burn us out. You let him try to kill my husband." The townspeople fell silent. They looked at Silas, then at Clara. "He is lying," Clara said, her voice raw. "They came in the night. They came with torches. They came to kill him. She's lost her mind." "Sheriff," Silas blustered. "She's..." "Be quiet, Silas," Father Paul said, his voice sharp. He stepped forward, his face etched with a terrible sadness. "Clara is telling the truth." All eyes went to the priest. "What?" Brody said. I should have spoken sooner. God forgive my caution." The priest said. He looked at the crowd. "After I last visited here, I felt a deep wrongness. I wrote to a colleague in the Bighorn Basin. I asked him to find Elias Thorne, Mr. Reed's former employer." Silas's face went pale. "I received a letter back on the stage yesterday afternoon," the priest continued, pulling a folded paper from his coat. "It is from Mr. Thorne. He is dying. He wished to clear his conscience." He unfolded the letter. His voice shook as he read. "My brother, Arthur, was a violent man, especially in drink. He attacked my niece, Maggie, Jonas Reed, a good and quiet man. Intervened. My brother pulled a knife. Mr. Reed defended himself, and my niece, Arthur, was killed in the struggle. To protect my family's name, I lied to the sheriff. I said Mr. Reed had murdered him. I sent Maggie away. I've carried the weight of what I did to that good man for 5 years. I pray God will forgive me." A terrible, profound silence fell over the yard. The only sound was Eli's low moaning, "Mrs." Henderson put her hands to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, dear God!" The crowd's anger, which had been aimed at the cabin, now turned, slow and heavy, onto Silas Croft. Silas looked around, his eyes wide with panic. I didn't know. You just what, Silas?" Sheriff Brody said, his voice like iron. He stepped toward him. "You just brought a posse to lynch an innocent man?" He looked at Abe's body. "You brought guns. You brought torches." Brody pulled his pistol. "Silas Croft, you and Eli Miller are under arrest for incitement, for attempted murder, and for this." Silas's bravado shattered. He began to weep. We just wanted to scare him." Clara's strength, held by rage for so long, finally gave out. The rifle barrel dipped toward the ground. She sagged against the splintered door frame, the world swimming, misses. Henderson ran to her, catching her. "Clara, child, forgive us. He is hurt," Clara whispered, her voice gone. "He is shot. Please, help him." The dam of shame broke. The townspeople surged forward, not in anger, but in a desperate, clumsy wave of remorse. "Get the wagon! Mr. Henderson, fetch my medical bag!" Brody and the priest pushed past Clara into the dim, bloody cabin. Jonas was on the bed, his eyes fluttering. He saw the sheriff's badge, the priest's collar. He tensed, his hand fumbling for a gun that was not there. "It is all right, son," Brody said, his voice rough. "It is over. We know. Jonas looked at him, his gaze weak, feverish, and confused. You know? Clara stumbled to the bedside, falling to her knees. She grabbed his hand. It was cold. They know the truth. Jonas, they know. He looked at her, at the tears streaming down her soot-stained face. He looked at the priest, at the sheriff, at the faces of the townspeople peering in, their expressions no longer filled with hate, but with a terrible, aching pity. He squeezed her hand. His lips moved. She had to lean down, her ear to his mouth, to hear his whisper. I never thought, he breathed, the words tearing at his throat. I never thought anyone would believe me again. Clara pressed her forehead to his, her own tears falling onto his pale, cold cheek. They do not need to, she whispered fiercely, her voice thick. I do. They worked all day. The men, quiet and ashamed, took Abe's body. They carried Eli to a wagon. Sheriff Brody took Silas away in irons. The others stayed. Mr. Henderson, his face grim, began to organize. The fence is down. The door is ruined. The window. We will fix it, one of the ranchers said. They worked in silence. They rebuilt the corral. They hung a new, solid door. They put new glass in the window. Mrs. Henderson and the other women took over the cabin. They cleaned the blood from the floor. They brought clean linens and broth and bandages. They tended to Jonas, their touch gentle, their faces full of a remorse they could not speak. Clara sat by the bed, holding his hand, not sleeping, just watching him breathe. A few weeks later, Jonas was sitting in a chair in the sun, wrapped in a blanket, pale and thin, but alive. The fever had broken. A wagon approached. It was not the sheriff. It was a family from a homestead 5 miles down the creek. Clara did not know them. The man and woman approached, twisting their hats in their hands. Mrs. Reed, the woman asked, her voice shy. We heard what happened, and, well, we heard you were a teacher back in Ohio. Clara looked at her, confused. A long time ago. Why? Our children, the man said, gesturing to 2 small, barefoot children hiding behind the wagon. They cannot read a bit. Father Paul, he said you were a good reader, a good woman. Clara looked at the children. She looked at Jonas. He was watching her, and on his scarred, pale face was the faint, unmistakable light of pride. She turned back to the woman and nodded, a small smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. Yes, she said. I am. Bring them here. We can start tomorrow. The woman's face lit up. God bless you, Mrs. Reed. Clara, she said, her voice quiet but strong. Just call me Clara. Months later, the world was reborn in green and gold. The high, wind-torn plains, once a canvas of brown and gray, had exploded into life. Summer had come to Wyoming. The grass grew so high it rippled like a green ocean, dotted with the bright, defiant yellow of sunflowers and the pale purple of wild lupine. The air was warm, thick with the smell of hot pine and sweet clover, alive with the lazy drone of insects. The wind, which had been their tormentor, was now a friend, a soft, warm breath that carried the sound of meadowlarks. The homestead, once a half-collapsed ruin, thrived. The patched roof, once a sieve, was now baked hard by the sun. The new door was solid, the new glass window, a gift from Mr. Henderson, was clean and bright, and through it spilled not just sunlight, but the sound of voices. Clara's school was in session. It had begun with the 2 shy children from the wagon. Now, there were 7. 3 mornings a week. A small cluster of ponies and 1 farm wagon would gather in their yard. The children, ranging in age from 6 to 13, would sit on the cabin floor or at the small table, their faces pinched with concentration. Clara, her hair tied back, a smudge of chalk on her cheek, was a different woman. The fear had left her eyes. She was no longer the haunted widow, nor the terrified bride. She was the teacher. She was patient, her voice clear and kind as she pointed to the letters she had written on a piece of dark, smoothed slate. A, she would say. This is A for apple for Abe. A small boy would giggle. For axe. Yes, Clara would smile. For axe, too. And through it all, Jonas worked. He was slower. The bullet wound, though long healed, had left a deep, puckered scar on his side that pulled and ached when the air was damp, or when he lifted something too heavy. He had been shot, and his body would not let him forget it. He was thinner than when she had met him, but the wiry strength in his arms and shoulders had returned. He could no longer heave the heaviest logs, but his hands were as deft as ever. He worked at the edge of the cabin, mending tack or sharpening tools, pretending not to listen. But Clara would see him stop. She would see him watch the smallest child, a little girl named Sarah, struggle with a word. And when Sarah finally sounded it out, Clara would see the small, almost imperceptible nod Jonas gave, his eyes on his work. One afternoon, he had walked over to the girl, who was staring at his scarred face with a child's open, unafraid curiosity. He had said nothing. He had just reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, roughly carved piece of pine. It was a bird. He pressed it into her hand and walked away, his face rigid. The girl had treasured it as if it were gold. The scars were still there, inside and out. Jonas still woke in the night sometimes, his breath catching, his hand flying to the old wound or to his new one. But now, when he did, Clara was there. She would not speak. She would simply lay her hand on his chest, her touch a silent anchor in the darkness. He would cover her hand with his. His breathing would slow, and he would fall back asleep. They shared the bed. They shared the work. They shared the long, quiet evenings, sitting on the small porch he had built, watching the heat lightning flicker on the far horizon. The silence between them was no longer a wall. It was a comfort, a shared language. "We are out of salt," Clara said one evening in late August. "And coffee, and the children have used all the chalk." Jonas nodded. He looked at the horizon. "Tomorrow, then, we can go to town." Clara's stomach gave a small, familiar flutter. They had not been back to Three Forks since the day of the trial, where Silas Croft had been sentenced to 2 years for his part in the attack, and Eli, who had lost 2 toes to infection from his wound, had been run out of the territory. The town had helped them, an act of collective shame, but they had not faced them as peers. "It will be all right, Jonas," she said, though she was saying it as much for herself. He looked at her, his gray eyes clear. "I know." The next day, they rode in, not on horseback, but in a small, sturdy wagon Jonas had traded for, the one he used to haul water and timber. The sun was hot. The ride was slow. The town looked the same as it always had, busy, dusty, and loud. But as they pulled onto the main street, something was different. Sheriff Brody was outside his office. He saw them. He did not look away. He raised his hand, a clear, open salute. Jonas, after a moment's hesitation, raised his own in return. People stopped. They watched the wagon pass, but the whispers were gone. The smirks were gone. In their place was a new, awkward respect. Some men, ranchers she had seen in the crowd that terrible morning, nodded to her. "Ma'am," they said, respectfully, "Mrs." Henderson came bustling out of the mercantile, wiping her hands on her apron, her face wreathed in a genuine, flustered smile. "Clara, Mr. Reed, goodness, it is good to see you both. Jonas, you are looking well, so much better." "Ma'am," Jonas said, nodding as he helped Clara down. "You must come in. We have some new cloth. Clara, just in from Cheyenne. And chalk. Yes, We have plenty of chalk. Inside, Mr. Henderson hurried over, his hand outstretched. Jonas looked at the hand, then slowly took it. Mr. Reed, it is an honor to have you in my store. Mr. Henderson said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not hide. Anything you need, anything at all. Your credit is good here. It is the least we can do. We will pay, Jonas said, his voice quiet. He laid his small pouch of coins on the counter. Of course, Henderson said, flushing, pushing the coins gently back. But the first order is on the house, as a welcome back. They gathered their supplies, the salt, the coffee, the bacon, a small bag of hard candy, which Mrs. Henderson pressed into Clara's hand. For the children, she whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Clara felt a weight she had not even realized she was carrying finally lift. She was not the desperate widow. He was not the town killer. They were Mr. and Mrs. Reed, homesteaders. They loaded the wagon. Jonas was tying down the tarp, his back to the street. Clara was about to climb onto the seat when a man stepped off the boardwalk from the saloon. Clara froze. It was Matthew. He had been with Eli at the church. He had been one of the men in the posse, though he had fled before the shooting started. He was sober, his face pale, his hands twisting his hat. He stood near the wagon, looking at the ground. Jonas turned, his body going still, but not tense. He just watched the man. Matthew cleared his throat. He looked at Jonas, then quickly looked away, his face a deep, miserable red. Mr. Reed, he muttered. The word was almost lost in the street noise. I just wanted to. I am sorry for my part in it. Clara held her breath. She saw Jonas's shoulders set. She saw the old, familiar mask of coldness begin to settle on his face. She wanted to pull him away, to get in the wagon and go. But Jonas did not move. He just looked at the man. He looked at his downcast eyes, at the hat being mangled in his hands. Then his voice came, so low and soft Clara almost did not hear it. It was not the voice that stopped bullies. It was not a threat. It was a quiet, simple request. Say that again. Matthew flinched, as if he had been struck. He looked up, terrified, his eyes meeting Jonas's. He saw no anger there. He saw no threat. He saw only a man, standing in the sun, waiting. The man's shoulders sagged, not in fear, but in shame. He took a ragged breath and spoke, his voice clear this time, for the whole street to hear. I said, I'm sorry, Mr. Reed. I was wrong. I am sorry. Jonas held his gaze for a long second. Then he nodded. Once, he turned, took Clara's arm, and helped her up into the wagon. As Jonas climbed up beside her, she looked at him, at this scarred, quiet man, who had faced down his past not with violence, but with a terrible, quiet dignity. And then she laughed. It was the laugh from the ridge, the one that had been startled out of her by the wind. But this one was different. It was deep and full, and it came from a place of such profound relief it felt like a sob. Tears welled in her eyes, shining in the hot, bright sun. They spilled over, rolling down her cheeks, but she did not stop laughing. Jonas looked at her, at the tears, at the laugh, and the scar on his face pulled, his mouth tilted, and he smiled, a true, unguarded smile that lit his gray eyes and erased all the years of pain. He smiled, and he reached over, and he took her hand. They rode out of town, holding hands, the wagon rattling behind them. They did not speak. They did not need to. They returned home as the sun was beginning to touch the western horizon. The world was awash in the colors of the sunset. The sky was a vast, bruised canvas of gold, and fiery red, and deep, soft purple. The air was cool, smelling of dust and the coming night. They worked together, unhitching the horses, putting the supplies away. The quiet of the homestead settled around them like a warm blanket. Clara stood by the corral, watching the last sliver of sun disappear. Jonas came to stand beside her. The grass is good, he said, his voice a low rumble in the dusk. That bottomland, by the creek, it is good grass. Clara looked at him. "Yes, it is. Good enough for a herd," he said, not looking at her, his eyes on the darkening hills. "A small one, maybe 10, 15 head to start." She smiled, her heart full. "I think it is. Jonas." He was quiet for a long time. He took his hat off and ran his hand through his hair. This cabin, it is small." "It is," she agreed. "It is small," he repeated, his voice halting. For the children. For the school." She knew he meant more. She reached out and took his hand, his rough, calloused fingers laced with hers. "We could add a room," she said softly, "before the winter comes. We have time." He turned to her, and in the deep twilight, she could see the hope in his eyes, a hope so new, so fragile, it made her want to weep all over again. "A man," he started, his voice thick. "A man ought to have a family." She squeezed his hand. "Yes, Jonas, he should." He nodded, his throat too tight to speak. They stood there together, by the rebuilt fence, the one that had been torn down in hate and rebuilt, first in defiance and then in remorse. They were two people, scarred and marked by the world, two people the world had tried to break and had failed. They stood, unbroken, their hands clasped, facing the vast, darkening horizon and the quiet, hopeful future they would build together. Thank you for listening to this story. We encourage you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with other fans, and we hope you will subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts.